Good morning and welcome. This is our monthly roundtable series of Dentons Smart Cities and Connected Communities think tank. Our topic today is the path to decarbonization, and we'll be focusing on COP28 and beyond. We have assembled some of my favorite experts in the field of energy and climate, and we will be discussing not just what is happening at COP and what the prospects are, but also what's real and what's not right now in terms of energy and climate policy. My name is Clint Vince. I chair Denton's U.S. energy practice, and I co-chair our transportation and infrastructure sector globally. We also founded and co-chair our Smart Cities think tank together with my teammate Emma Hand. And we have, on a positive note, grown to more than 750 thought leaders from around the globe. On another positive note, our think tank our energy practice was just named Energy Law Firm of the Year for the third year in a row by Who's Who Legal. And also on a third positive note, we're deeply honored to be co-sponsoring this roundtable with our dear friends at the Keystone Policy Center. And as part of their Key Conversations program. And to give us a very warm welcome is the amazing CEO of Keystone, Christine Scanlon.
Thank you so much, Clint. And I want to share my congratulations to Dentons on such a well-earned honor. That's just amazing news to end the year with. Thank you for Dentons including us on these very important, timely topics. And Clint, this is probably one of the best panels, I think, that have been assembled for the Key Conversations topics and issues. And candidly, we have such great history with so many of you today that it's also a bit of a reunion. So I just want to thank our panelists for joining today and sharing their brilliance and insights with us. And again, thank you, Clint and the Dentons team. It's awesome to do this in collaboration with you.
Thank you, Christine. And I really do believe, I agree with you. Each time we do a roundtable, I express that I think it's the best group of panelists that we've ever assembled. But today we really have the best of the best. And I'm so thrilled that with COP concluding and so much going on in the lives of these busy professionals that we were able to get everyone together for the next hour or so. And we're going to start today with Carl Hosker, who is a senior fellow with the World Resources Institute's climate program. WRI is often named as the #1 environmental and energy think tank in the world. And they're near and dear to my heart and Sue Tierney's heart, as we've served on their board for many, many years. And I currently chair their Global Energy Advisory Council. We'll actually be meeting later today with the council. Our next panelist is Melanie Kenderdine. Melanie's the Executive Vice President and Corporate Secretary for the EFI Foundation, which she co-founded with former Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz and with Joe Heischer, the former CFO at DOE. And I think Melanie has probably logged more time as a political appointee at DOE over different periods in her life than any human being. And the Energy Futures Initiative, like WRI, is near and dear to my heart. I have the honor of serving on Melanie's board as well. Sue Tierney is a senior advisor to the analysis group and is the director of the World Resources Institute and the Energy Foundation. Sue and I 1 year co-chaired Aspen Institute's Energy Week. It was one of the highlights of my professional career. We had a lot of fun and learned a lot. And our fourth panelist and cleanup hitter is Casper Spokas, who's the director of, has the coolest title that I think I'm aware of. He's the Director of Insights and Integration Strategy at the Clean Air Task Force. And he received the highest recommendation from Armand Cohen to join us today. So Carl, you've been at COP. Can you first take a moment to just describe WRI and the importance of COP to you, and then we'll get into some of the key takeaways.
Yeah, thanks, Vince. Thanks, Christine. Great to be here with you all. Yeah, as you said, World Resources Institute is a leading think tank in the environment, climate, energy space. It's been around for over 30 years and has grown enormously, particularly in the last 10 or 12 years, to about 2,000 people with offices in the US and then international offices in China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, and projects in Africa too. So we're truly international and working on all aspects of sustainability, but with a big emphasis on climate change. I have been to several COPs previously. I did not attend this, our current COP, but let me just give a couple reflections on what's happening there. We presume it's going to conclude today and issue a final text. Last time I checked, they're still working on it, as is so often the case. I think it's fair to say that with every conference of the parties of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, we get to the end and the glass is always half empty and half full. It is so difficult to reach consensus among 190 nations on an issue of this import. And those 190 nations are in wildly different situations. They have different resources base. Some are incredibly rich in fossil fuels. Some have almost none. They face a variety of different risks from climate change, from very imminent to perhaps a little further off or less damaging. There are different stages of economic development, from some of the least developed countries up to the richer industrialized countries. And of course, they also have different forms of government, from authoritarian regimes to full-fledged democracies and everything in between, which affects, in a sense, what governments can commit to and what they can deliver. So when we get to the end of a COP, the climate activists are always disappointed. We never made enough progress. And the activists on the other side of the spectrum, I'm not sure what label to give them, but there's constant harping about the looming economic damage of trying to do something about climate change, or threats to national sovereignty by this global approach to the problem, and still occasionally just saying climate change is not really a problem, still in some form of denial. This COP is no different. And what's most often the most important steps that come out of a COP are not what 190 nations agree to at the very end formally, but the commitments and pledges that are made outside of the formal process by what I might call coalitions of the willing among nations or among nations and non-state actors. So let's just put aside for a moment, who knows what language is going to come out on phase down of fossil fuels or phase out of fossil fuels, with what qualifying language? Are they talking about fossil fuels in general, or the phase down or phase out of unabated fossil fuels? And what is the definition of unabated, or will be left undefined to bridge gaps between countries? Who knows? All we know is that there is quite a broad coalition that supports phase out language. It's adamantly opposed by Saudi Arabia, other OPEC nations, numbering perhaps 18 or more. And we also know the text also calls for the reduction of fossil fuel use to be just and orderly to lessen the impact. But who knows exactly where that's going to come out, but it's also less important for what we need to do this decade. Obviously, we need to decrease the use of fossil fuels and increase zero carbon energy sources. But let's just take a real quick look at what has happened on the sort of the sidelines of COP. So 118 governments have pledged to triple the world's renewable energy capacity by 2030. Also pledging to double the global rate of energy efficiency improvements by 2030. We've had more than 20 nations sign a declaration aiming to triple nuclear capacity by 2050. And before COP even started, we had the US and China agree bilaterally to really move ahead on major demonstration projects of carbon capture and storage. We even had a little announcement by the US on fusion strategy, including calls to share research facilities and assess standards with other global partners for that technology that may play a role later in this century. I'd also really like to highlight actions on methane emissions. Usually we just talk about CO2 from the energy sector, but methane emissions are very important for that among the 20% impact of the other greenhouse gases. They're short-lived, but they have a very high warming impact. And by controlling them this decade, we can really stave off some of the warming that would otherwise occur and give us some breathing room for the longer-term energy transition. So China has agreed for the first time to include methane in its overall greenhouse gas targets. We had the Biden administration unveil its final proposed rules for reducing methane emissions from the US oil and gas industry. A coalition of the willing governments, philanthropists, private sector announced a plan for $1 billion in grants to support efforts to reduce methane. And the World Bank also launched a blueprint for methane reduction to set up 15 national programs to cut methane from rice production, livestock operations, and waste management. Overall, there's been a lot more attention to methane, both in the oil and gas sector emissions and agriculture. The FAO also released a roadmap to reduce emissions from agriculture-related sources. So that's a quick roundup. There's also been a lot more attention to adaptation and the creation of loss of damage fund. But let me stop there and turn it back to you, Clint.
Carlo, is a great overview and one of the best explanations of the diversity of countries and diversities of their circumstances that often is not emphasized enough. But we're going to come back to each of the key points that you made in our discussion once we've introduced each of our panelists. And we'll go next to Melanie Kenderdine. Melanie, do you want to talk for a moment about the EFI Foundation? And then we can talk a little bit about your perception of COP28 and maybe start to focus a little bit on the CCS issue that Carl pointed to.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And it's wonderful to be here and with a group of friends on this panel that with the exception of Kasparis, we all know, I don't know Kasparis, but everyone else, we've been working together for decades, and that says something about our age. But EFI Foundation is a 501c3 think tank focused on the deep decarbonization of energy systems. And we focus on what is practical, what is achievable, what is technologically possible. We hear a lot of fairy stories out there about how to address climate change, and our analysis looks at how we really need to focus on an all of the above strategy, look at the different regions of the country and the world. Addressing climate change is going to be very, very different in different regions of the country and the world. I would back up and I would say that I think that, and it is how we operate at EFI Foundation, that climate change is an existential threat. But we have to address it thoughtfully, in sequenced ways, and in ways that are technologically feasible, and invest in innovation in areas where we don't currently have the technologies to get to net zero. And was very interested, Brian, in some of the issues you raised about global. This is a global problem. I think we tend to focus too much on the United States and on something like CCUS. I think we need CCUS in the United States much more for the industrial sector, the more difficult to decarbonize sector. But in the rest of the world, and I'll give you just one or two data points, in 1 year, China and India, two countries out of 200 in the world, had under construction, not announced projects, actual under construction, 165,000 megawatts of coal generation. 1 year, two countries. That year, the entire US fleet of coal generation was 235,000 megawatts. So I find it amazing that people who say we don't need CCS, when you look at those kinds of statistics, and everyone knows the lifespan of those generation facilities is going to be 40, 50 years, and they're not going to shut them down because of climate change. I'll give another global example. We did a study in Africa. I've spent a lot of time in Africa and work with an organization called Africa 50. They have 26, 28 countries now that are members of Africa 50. It is an investment fund, infrastructure investment fund. We did an analysis for them. It's public. It's on our website. And there were in Africa, of the 26 members of Africa 50, 7 or 8 of them, rural electrification was 1% or lower. So electrification in places like Africa is hugely important. They might be able to bypass some of what the rest of the world has, how they have electrified, okay, but hugely important. But another thing about Africa, the world by 2030 will add 10 cities of 10 million people or more. 6 million of them, 6 of those 10 cities of 10 million or more will be in Africa. They are not going to be powering those cities with solar panels on rooftops. Okay, so we need to be thinking globally. This is a global problem. How do we address it? I'm just illustrating a couple of the huge regional differences around the world. There are very different regional differences in the United States as well. And so the bottom line, we need an all of the above strategy to address what I believe is an existential threat to the planet. And we shouldn't be being ideologically wedded to one or two options. We need an all of the above strategy, and we need to do things that are technically feasible. Right now, there's a lot of advocacy out there for things that are not technically feasible at this point. And so just a few thoughts on comments about what we are working on. So thank you.
Melanie, we're going to come back to you on a few of those points. And also, I want to invite members of the participants in the audience to come in on the Q&A feature on this platform if you have questions for any of the panelists, and we'll do our best to try to get to them. Melanie, I'm so glad you mentioned Africa. Our law firm has a major presence in that region, and there's a lot of disappointment among developing countries in Africa that, first of all, that the United States has been one of the great polluters for so many years, and now is basically attempting to shut down many countries before they really electrify at a serious level. And there's just a feeling of hypocrisy
Right.
that we often don't recognize in the U.S. And I'm also really glad you talked about carbon capture and sequestration, however you want to frame that term. I just don't know how we deal with China and India and Brazil and Vietnam and lots of other places without being able to give them technological options that cut back on their fossil fuel use, but that are likely to be accepted by them. And I do hope we can bring electrification throughout Africa, but it's going to have some very, very significant implications that it would be great if we can get some technological support to enable other countries to thrive as they develop, just as we have. So why don't we go now to Sue Tierney, who is on more boards, I think, than anyone I know. She's had, like Melanie, she's had many leadership positions in government service as well as in the private sector. Like Melanie, she's got too many awards to list, and Carl, and likely Kasper's as well. But Sue, can you tell us a little bit about the analysis group, and then some of your immediate perceptions on COP, and then we'll come back and dig in a little bit on these issues that Carl and Melanie have been raising.
Thank you, Clint. And first, let me express my appreciation to you personally for your thought leadership in these issues. You've been doing it for decades, of course, but you are the Energizer Bunny. And so thank you so much for that. And congratulations to Dentons for this incredible and well-deserved honor. Thanks to the attendees for joining us today. I'm looking forward to your questions, and I appreciate the comments that Carl and Melanie have just made about the COP, and they have shared many important issues about what's happening globally. At the moment, with your indulgence, everyone, I'd like to spend a few minutes about the United States, and let me explain why. I think that the US, of course, plays an essential role in the COP. Clint, you just said why. We were the major polluter for decades and decades and decades. We are continue to be a major polluter, and we stand to take a leadership role. And in fact, I think went to the COP this year with the extraordinary benefit of having passed 3 federal laws that are just monumental in terms of their game-changing nature. The Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act associated with computers and information technology, and then as well the Inflation Reduction Act. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the US. I am a senior advisor at the analysis group headquartered in Boston. We're about a 2,000 person consulting firm. And when I'm not doing day job things, I am involved in a number of boards. The through line of all of them is the climate crisis and addressing climate issues. And I do that at Resources for the Future, at World Resources Institute, at the Climate Leadership Initiative, and a variety of other organizations. Let me just spend a couple of minutes about the US. I mentioned that we have the benefit of a hard-fought battle to get some federal game-changing action. And that has come in those three laws that I just mentioned. And modeling indicates that those will get us 70 to 80% toward the 2030 targets that keep us on track toward a net zero economy. So they're very, very important. And both Melanie and Carl have talked about important technology portfolios and actions that are available and need to be taken. I ascribe to the all of the above approach that both of them take. I ascribe to this is an existential threat that we are now facing. And let me just spend one more minute or two on what I would like to tee up as some critical success factors to even getting what the modeling says we can expect to see from these technology options and pathways. And these are the very sticky social issues that are associated with our institutional structures, our legal arrangements. And I am focusing on the United States when I'm making these, but some of these points, of course, are relevant for other settings. Legal, litigation, regulatory action in a timely way, execution on those dollar incentives moving out of government and into the hands of the private sector, financial markets and fiscal incentives that otherwise create disincentives for action in a timely way. Things like just quarterly filings to shareholders, which keep a focus more on the short term than the long term. The important political traction associated with narratives about who's causing climate change, who's at fault, and so forth, those often stand in the way, and it has become a partisan issue, not just in the United States, but elsewhere. Those are important issues, communications issues about the public health considerations that are not just collateral benefits of addressing climate change, but are on the ground realities for communities that are frontline to unabated fossil fuels. So those are just the tip of the iceberg. The reason I mention these is if these do not get as much attention, if not more, than our technology paths, then we are not going to make the changes that we think need to happen. And so the technology stuff is hard, but I think it's easy compared to some of these other people systems that are very critical. And I'm happy to talk more about that later. Clint, let me just stop at that point again with appreciation.
Well, you've concluded your introduction with really one of the major areas of focus of our think tank, our Smart Cities and Connected Communities think tank. We had, the term think tank started, Smart Cities started with IBM and some of the tech companies, really to develop greater technology. Purpose of our think tank was to expand that definition. We look at smart cities and communities as basically all about modernizing infrastructure. And when we use that term, we include digital and technology, but we also talk about physical infrastructure and then social infrastructure, which was the point you were driving home a moment ago. And what we're finding in our many roundtables and analysis is that social infrastructure is woefully behind technology, and it's way behind what is going to be needed to achieve the types of goals that you and Carl have just been talking about. So we'll come back to that issue again. It's real. I'm so glad you mentioned it because it's just so critically important. And Kasparis, we invite you to join this seasoned team as a person more youthful and with fresh ideas. So we're counting on you to be our cleanup hitter today. And can you, first of all, just take a moment to describe the Clean Air Task Force and your role and then we'll talk a little bit about your immediate perceptions on COP28.
Yeah, sounds good. And thank you very much for having me. I'm very honored to be included in this distinguished panel. It's quite difficult to go after these three panelists because so much has already been said in such a good way, but I'll give it a go. And congrats to Denton for a well-deserved recognition. So Clean Air Task Force is a global nonprofit think tank. Our mission is to promote practical and durable ways to manage climate change through a variety of pragmatic policies, business strategies, and advanced technologies. It was originally formed in 1996, I believe, in Boston to work on Clean Air Act litigation, but has since really expanded. I think we now have 12 or 13 programs in various regional teams with 175 staff over North America, Europe, MENA, Sub-Saharan Africa, and some in Latin America as well. And so we like to think of ourselves as practical yet ambitious in terms of how we try to approach the problem. Yeah, with regards to the COP28 and really 2024 as a year, I think this year marks a year where the world started appreciating some of the realities and challenges of tackling climate change. A lot of headwinds have, I think, come up with higher interest rates, supply chain challenges, and the global stock take was released this year ahead of COP, which very clearly showed we were off track. Fossil fuels still make up roughly 80% of primary energy supply, and continues to grow in terms of overall supply as energy demand grows worldwide. So I think we're starting to come to a realization that only setting targets and providing some incentives won't just magically transform a global economy that for decades and generations has been developed off of fossil fuels. And I think that's important. I think it's really important to be clear-eyed about the challenges and the barriers that we face in order to be able to properly adapt strategies and not just keep pushing into headwinds, ones that might lead to speed limits that do not put us on path to meet these targets. So Carl and Melanie spoke about nuclear and CCS. I think it's worth noting that these solutions to date have been erroneously opposed by a lot of green groups in terms of being solutions with a license to be part of the technological solution set. And I think this year we started to see that, and I'll say, despite the fact that underlying research and science studies cited in the IPCC, show that these solutions are very important and necessary to meet overall goals. And I hope Carl can get into some of the specifics of, the underlying studies in the IPCC reports. So, I see this year as a bit of a turning point. Nuclear has gained a lot more support over the last year. I think the declaration to triple nuclear energy by 20 countries at COP, whether it will be achieved or not, it's certainly a symbolic recognition that nuclear energy is part of the solution set to achieve a net zero economy. We also have encouraging signs out from a recent Pew Research Center poll showing the majority of Americans support nuclear, and with steadily increasing support since 2016. We have nuclear announcements worldwide from Canada to Poland. And I think it's worth mentioning that Clean Air Task Force, in collaboration with EFI, Melanie's group, also launched a global playbook for nuclear energy development in embarking countries. So countries that, have historically not had nuclear fleets, but might have ambition to do so, which I think is important in the global context of some of the discussions earlier. On CCUS, we're also seeing kind of the tides turning. The major green group in Germany now supports CCUS for industry, which something that would have been unimaginable a couple of years ago. And I think regions are also appreciating that, this takes more than just a target and some incentives. It takes significant efforts to change how we plan systems and how we build systems. And I hope later on I'll get to provide some perspective on that in terms of what's necessary from a planning perspective. So yeah, I actually see this kind of year as getting a grip of reality to be a net positive, because it allows us to kind of break free from some of the more strategies that will face headwinds if we don't adapt. So I'll end my opening remarks there, and again, thank you for including me in this panel.
Great remarks, Kasparis, and you also, in the beginning of your comments, beautifully teed up Carl to address not just some of the positives of COP, but also some of the bottlenecks. I know that Carl's done a lot of work looking at issues like siting and permitting and mining reform and other issues that are going to be vital to meet those goals that he mentioned were expressed at COP by 118 countries, that is tripling renewables and doubling energy efficiency. And I do also hope that sometime during the course of this discussion, we really focus in on energy efficiency a little bit, because I believe that's an under-recognized and vitally important tool that we've got. But Carl, why don't we come back to you? And we've just thrown about 40 subjects at you, so you can select which ones you want to address. You're on mute, Carl.
Thanks. I want to start off by just annotating a little bit on the term all of the above. I think Sue used it, Melanie used it, and they don't necessarily, I'm not saying they're going to agree with everything I say, but let me give you my personal take on it. When President Obama says all of the above, or when President Biden says all of the above, or anyone saying that we need to push all of these low or zero carbon technologies, in my mind, it is not some kind of mushy, middle of the road compromise, or let's sort of throw a little something to every interest group that backs all these technologies. Quite the opposite. The reason we need to push ahead on all promising technologies is because we don't know exactly how far they can take us. Where are going to be the technological limits, the economic limits or barriers, or the political barriers to siting or acceptance? And so, yes, we have a whole range of technologies from fully commercialized, like solar and wind, and existing nuclear plants running, to ones that are kind of ready for the demonstration phase, like some of the advanced nuclear technologies and some of the innovative carbon capture approaches, and then stuff that's really just at the R&D stage, like fusion. And so we need to sort of place some chips on all of these technologies and see how they develop. No single one is going to solve the whole problem. Some may race ahead, and particularly when we think about the electricity sector, we know that we can go pretty far with solar and wind grids in some parts of the world where you have abundant solar and wind, but we're ultimately going to have to complement that solar and wind with some kind of clean, firm source. We all know that lithium batteries are cheap now, and they can provide some short-term storage, but we need medium duration storage. We need long duration storage. And those are all at the R&D and demo phase. We can't bet the climate on just assuming we're going to have cheap long duration storage. So put some chips there, put some chips on carbon capture and storage for the power sector, as well as Melanie said, it's probably going to be essential in certain industrial applications, and put some chips on various forms of advanced nuclear, whether it's large Gen 3, Gen 4 plants, or whether it's a number of the SMR designs that are now being piloted. So to me, that's what all the above means. It means a diverse portfolio of technologies that reduce the risk of any particular technology crapping out or ending up too costly or hitting political siting deployment barriers. And I'll just finish with something I think that Casper referred to. There is, and I'll put a blog I did in the chat section of our webinar. I just finished up two plus years as an expert reviewer on the IPCC Working Group 3. And I want to say that this long 2,000+ page report is a great source of information. It's objective, it's balanced in terms of charting the different pathways we could take to try to limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. But funny things happen when the nations sit around to write the summary for policymakers. Certain technologies drop out or sort of disappear from the summary. In this case, there was almost no reference to nuclear in the IPCC summary for policymakers, although there was a good endorsement and objective discussion of CCS potential and CCS's roles. And then we come to the documents produced in the run-up to COP28. The September technical report of the global stocktake did not even contain the word nuclear and had just passing reference to CCS. And then the UN emissions gap report that came out in November, again, an important document feeding into the COP deliberations, barely mentioned nuclear and had a discussion of carbon capture almost entirely focused on carbon dioxide removal through BECCS, bioenergy, through direct air capture, which is important, but almost nothing on CCS options for mitigation in industry and power. So this is a real problem, and we've got to make sure that everybody in and out of government understands that what the experts at the IPCC concluded in AR6 was that we need this full, broad technology portfolio to solve this problem. So I'll stop there and put my blog in the chat box. I think you'll be interested.
Thank you, Carl. And we'll also take your blog and make sure that Dorinda Graves circulates that when we circulate the recording of this session. Melanie, I'm going to come back to you on carbon capture and nuclear because I know you're deeply involved in each of those subjects. But one of the points that Carl made earlier was that 50 of the world's largest oil and gas companies made a pact to come close to terminating methane emissions by the end of this decade. Are you able to comment on that at all? And you're on mute too.
Sorry. On methane emissions, and I was very happy to hear the agreement that had been reached on by the oil and gas industry on reducing methane emissions. I went to Katowice, Poland, for I think it was COP24. I don't know. I can't remember which COP it was, but it was in Poland, and gave a speech on this topic then, and said to the industry, capture your methane emissions. And I think that's hugely important. Was there Mark Brownstein, EDF, talked to Mark, why are you so focused on methane emissions? And he was 100% right. It's because of the early gains you get from methane emissions reductions. And you read a lot about methane being a much more powerful greenhouse gas emissions than carbon, and it is. But its residence in the atmosphere is 10 to 12 years compared to 1,000 years for CO2. And so you get early gains, but what you don't want to do is lose focus on CO2. Okay, because 80% of the emissions are CO2, and it's 1,000 years, it's compounding. Methane 10 to 12 years. And so just a point there. But what I would say on methane emissions is, and I'm going to give you some, because I'm a data freak, in the US, 22.8% of methane emissions, these are EPA data, are from gas systems, and 6.3% are from petroleum oil systems. So basically you're at 30% from gas and oil. Agriculture and services, and the services are basically landfills, are 62% of methane emissions. And so what you will get from oil and gas systems, and there are technologies that exist for reducing methane emissions from oil and gas systems, you will get very early gains, but it is not going to solve the methane emissions reduction problem. In the world, okay, those are US numbers. In the world, global methane emissions from gas systems are 10%. And much higher from agriculture. A lot of rice paddies emit a lot of methane, et cetera, et cetera. And so we do need to focus on the early gains we can get from methane emissions and the early gains we can get from oil and gas systems, but not lose sight of the larger problem of methane emissions from agriculture and landfill, for which we need to be investing in technologies, biodigesters and those kinds of things that we could use to reduce methane emissions from agriculture systems. Another thing I'd say in the US, again, these are EPA data, methane emissions from oil and gas systems between 2008 and 2021 already declined by 13.4%. So there has been some action in the US for reducing methane emissions. And I would also note at that same time period, natural gas consumption rose by 38.7%. So reductions in methane emissions at the same time, gas is becoming a much more significant source of energy in the United States. And so capture your methane emissions. It will not be the end all solution to methane emissions because you have much greater emissions from other sectors, and we need to be investing in innovation for those sectors. So,
thank you, Melanie. Perfect. Sue, you have been part of a report or study by the National Academies Committee that was recently issued on decarbonizing the U.S. economy. Do you want to give us some of your key takeaways on that?
I'd love to. Thank you very much, Clint. Back in 2020, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in the United States launched a 3-year project that would answer the question, what would it take to put the United States on a pathway to a net zero economy by mid-century? The committee, of which I was a member, includes an unusual combination of researchers and scholars and experts, some of which are focused and expert on technologies, and others of which are focused on social sciences, equity, public participation, engagement, public health. So it was a mixture of people who are both, engineering, economists, and technologists, and people who think about how you get there. And so the first report of this committee was issued in February of 2021. And the task of that one was to look at what action could take place by the federal US government to address greenhouse gas emissions and get us on track. And we issued a report. I will put it in the chat. And that report happily recommended a number of things that the United States did in the past 2 years. And amongst the things were providing incentives for technology deployment and R&D and so forth. We issued a second report, which is unfortunately 650 pages long, but it is designed to be readable and accessible to people who are interested in a particular topic. This report focuses not just on the technologies, which were addressed in the first report. This report, which came out in October of this year, looks at greenhouse gas reductions, but it also looks at public health issues, employment issues, public engagement issues, and identifies a number of findings about how far we get based on federal action, state action, private sector commitments, and local government and civil society activities. And again, the modeling shows that we are on track to get things done, but much of our report really focuses on these how questions. How do we get there? And execution risk, political and social risk, litigation risks, and, you know, big uncertainty events like pandemics and wars are key disruptors that make it very difficult to move forward. Can I just talk for a minute about two things, Clint?
Absolutely.
One of them is a topic we haven't talked about, and that's transmission, electric transmission. And the other one, let me talk about the demand side, energy efficiency, which you just mentioned. So on transmission, in order to meet our aspirations in the United States and elsewhere for hooking up all of those remarkable technologies and connecting those zero carbon emitting sources of power to meet the needs of an electrified economy requires a lot of wires and a lot of wire solutions. And so it really requires an unprecedented build out here as well as in other countries. Think of Africa for that one, for sure. The United States is not centrally planned. China has done a lot better job of building out its transmission system than we have here in the United States. And our experience shows us that it's easy to build lines that keep the lights on, and that's their principal purpose. It's really hard to build things for public policy and for saving money. And our planning is challenged in a number of different ways. First of all, it's, you know, inhabited, the planning processes are inhabited by people whose day job it is to focus on these issues. And they focus on planning in their region or their utility and not across really big regions, and certainly does not involve bringing people whose backyards are going to be chopped up or crossed by a transmission line. And so who's at the table matters a lot. And so there are a number of procedural equity issues that need to be addressed as part of the transmission siting and planning process in order to make it so that we don't end up having litigation on every single line that the experts say we need. I'm happy to say more about that, but I want to just mention one other topic on transmission, and that is I recently participated in a workshop hosted by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where the first set of panelists were talking about the reliability impacts of keeping the lights on in extreme weather events that crossed half of the United States, so much cold that so much of our fleet of power plants was out of service. So regions in the entire eastern side of the United States, you know, really from the Rockies east, were facing the threat of outages, or in fact had outages at one point in time. And yet we plan for little pieces of the grid that focus on what are the benefits to this little part of the grid and what are the benefits of that. And yet the entire system now depends upon the rest of the system. And so thinking about who benefits from a build out really requires a different kind of thinking, not just traditional monetization of the benefits of power production, redispatch, and other things, but thinking about reliability in very different ways now that we have are emerging into an economy where reliability will be fundamental to mobility, to heating, to just keeping, telephones and everything else hooked up. So thinking about benefits and costs and being able to expand our legal concepts so that you don't end up hitting a live wire on litigation about beneficiaries' pay is really important. Let me
Sue,
just spend.
before you
Yeah.
move off that
Yeah.
point, which is so critical, and I mentioned to you in the practice session for this talk that yesterday we talked about the very issues that you're making with the United States Energy Association in a press briefing, which I know many of you on the panel have also participated in. And what struck me the most is how unsolved these critical issues are. And, if you mentioned transmission and the problem of planning it, and then how do you share certain costs and benefits in an equitable way. Right now it takes 12 to 15 years to build a major transmission line. I don't see us getting to the destination that's needed on climate unless there is a really dramatic change in our governance on this. The Federal Power Act was created not for, it's such an antiquated statute. It was not created for regional power transmission. And the whole concept of energy federalism doesn't work here because it's now too slow. Energy federalism being the relationship between the federal government and the states on decision making. Would you, because of the extremity of the need and the real dangers on reliability, would you consider an approach that would involve more federal preemption? Yeah, me too.
Yeah. And let me just mention that this National Academy's report definitely calls for that. It calls for in conjunction with giving the federal government more authority. And there has been some movement in that direction in the last acts. It also involves just more inclusive processes to make sure that people do have voices in planning and in cost allocation and other things. And we have to do a much better job on that. So both centralized as well as inclusiveness is really important.
Melanie, I see you nodding your head. Yeah, please intervene.
A couple of points.
I'll come back to you on energy efficiency.
Yeah,
that's
a couple of points and just a very recent thought. You said the Federal Power Act was written in 1936. Okay, but actually the structure of our electricity markets, that law was passed in 2005. When Sue and I were at the Department of Energy, we had debates over it. That structure is already ancient based on the progression of technologies. So I think we need to restructure, we need to visit the structure of our electricity markets, because as Sue said, electricity supports every lifeline network we have. But one other point, and Sue, you raised transmission and the need to build out enormous transmission. You look at the Princeton Net Zero study. One of its scenarios says that by 2030, we need to increase our transmission capacity by 75% by 2030. Okay, that is 6 years away, folks. And so it's a reference frame, it's not reality. Based on that, I assumed that 60% of that 75% was new lines. The other 40% was new technologies to get more power onto existing lines. When you, if there are 5 towers per mile, 5 to 5.6, we need 360,000 transmission towers by 2030. And those towers are made with steel, aluminum, and copper. So are the lines you talked about, made with steel, aluminum, and copper. So are cell towers, so are EVs, so are EV charging stations. And it all begs the question about the need for an industrial strategy to do these things. And that industrial strategy, I think, is more critical than it's ever been. And so we are creating competition for incredible sources. That's another reason why you need industrial decarb, and but which is one of my areas. But I'll just shut up because I know Clint has more questions, and but I really think that we need to be thinking about those issues in very serious ways. And again, stop with the fairy stories. It's all going to happen. So
I so agree with you, Melanie.
Can I do a quick pile
we're
on?
gonna- Yes.
Quick pile on to Sue's points and Melanie's points. The only pathway to net zero requires this electrification of the economy across
Right.
buildings, transportation, and industry, substituting clean electricity for the combustion of fossil fuel. That's the only way to get there. And most studies of the US and other industrialized countries show that maybe we're using 20% of electricity directly for end use now. That needs to go to 60% or higher by 2050. It becomes the workhorse of the economy instead of fossil fuels. As we do that, if we don't keep our grids very reliable and very affordable, we will get blowback that will undermine the whole effort to solve the climate problem. So and we're already suffering reliability problems now, as you pointed out. So it's incredibly important to move forward with least cost grid expansion, highly reliable to get where we want to go.
Amen. In Texas, we had Winter Storm Uri a couple of years ago. 246 Texans died, 4.5 million in freezing weather for 4 or 5 days. The IMF, the Independent Market Monitor, just came out with a report this past week saying that ERCOT, the Texas market, has the worst performance that he's ever seen with an organized market.
Well, that's
So
a market structure problem, Clint.
It's an everything problem, but
Yeah,
you're right. It is.
Yeah.
It starts with market structure. You're
Right,
absolutely
right.
right, but it goes far beyond.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
And, Sue, did you have a comment?
Oh no, I just was agreeing with it. It's a multifaceted
Right, right.
problem in Texas.
In a minute, we're going to come back to Sue on energy efficiency, but Kaspers, you have co-authored a report titled Pledges to Plans. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. The discussion before this actually sets this up very well. I'm going to borrow a framework from a former colleague, Peter Fox-Benner, who some of you here might know well.
Dear friend.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, we wrote this report, a different report, several years ago, wherein it, kind of characterized climate actions in three buckets. One was setting targets, one was passing incentives, and the other was planning. And in this recent report, we're making the argument that in the US and Europe, we've made pretty good progress on updating targets, updating incentives, but we haven't done the hard work to update the third pillar, which is planning. And I think everything that was just discussed kind of goes to further support that. Climate is an infrastructure problem. We are tasked with completely transforming the global economy and doubling or tripling systems, much like power systems, like transmission that we were talking about. And financing that and building it requires very quickly and at scale overcoming a number of complex coordination, sequencing, and chicken and egg problems that are ultimately tasked to planners. And I think I think to some extent, the modeling community has done policymakers a little bit of a disservice in that, they provide these pathways to decarbonization that so far are directionally very useful in informing policymakers, but they don't have some of these underlying realities when it comes to, again, the complex coordination challenges. A lot of that infrastructure in those models are perfectly optimized and appear as necessary in the right places and the right sizes. But some of the development challenges of these are not considered. So I think we need to kind of, and I think it's been happening naturally with long interconnection queues in the US, reliability issues becoming more prominent. Some topics that we're seeing very little progress on, whether that's CO2 pipeline planning over regions, or even when we're talking about EV chargers, there are chicken and egg issues with building out a charging network. But it's difficult to do so before a critical mass of EVs, yet, customers are hesitant to buy EVs without the infrastructure. So there are all these very complex challenges that just are not represented in models, and we're never meant to be. But I think, as a policy community, we really need to kind of get back at that third pillar when it comes to planning. And I think the one thing I'll say too is, I used to work with Johannes Pfeifenberger on transmission planning. What's really interesting is he has 2 decades of reports in terms of how to do transmission planning. And when you look at them, not much has changed in terms of the recommendations of how to do it. But for a variety of reasons, political economy constraints, lack of capacity at local, state, regional levels, these solutions and these processes haven't been implemented. And so I think that just goes to show that, we really need to step up the amount of attention and the amount of attention that leaders place on improving planning. It's not as flashy as setting a target. It's not as flashy as passing an incentive. But I think we're getting to the point where those planning processes are the bottleneck. It's not the incentives. It's not the targets. So you mentioned we released a report ahead of COP, which was titled Pledges to Plans. And the point of it was to provide some principles of durable, effective planning, and to translate those into some components that could underlying a plan to decarbonize. And we tried to keep it to principles and components because planning is quite complex. There are many different levels, different jurisdictions do it different ways. So we were hoping to provide some principles that hopefully almost anybody in any sort of agency or region can take some of the principles and apply them to whatever they're working on. So I'll just quickly list them out for everyone's benefit. But one is proactive and risk aware, right? Really, we need to look ahead in the future and proactively develop infrastructure that meets future needs, not just a piecemeal kind of one-off solutions that meet near-term needs. And we need to mitigate the risk of uncertainty. I think Sue and Carl and Melanie, you've all brought up kind of the topic of uncertainty, and that will hit bottlenecks. We need to have that baked into how we're thinking about this in terms of what are optionality strategies to get around risks, and again, proactively de-risk certain barriers before they even materialize. The second one is multi-jurisdictional, cross-sectional, and systems perspectives. This means try to plan across regions to the extent that you can and across industries to the extent that you can. A classic example that's been really challenging in the US has been planning electrification and gas distribution, right? These are 2 industries that are, from a regulatory perspective, almost separated. In a lot of regions, very difficult to coordinate, yet to achieve a low-cost transition in many regions, you need that coordination. But right now, the regulatory structures aren't there to facilitate it in most regions. The third principle is co-created with all stakeholders. Again, this kind of directly tackles some of the planning challenges by kind of fostering a sense of ownership and accountability amongst parties if you include everybody throughout the planning process. Fourth, based on comprehensive scenario-based analysis, and then fifth, provides actionable roadmaps with progress tracking and adaptive learning. So I'll say there, I'll pause there, and I'll just finish by saying I'm happy that this report has actually gotten a lot of good feedback. It's at the end of the day, it's a little bit basic in that it's not applied, right? It's general, but we've shared this with some policymakers both in US states and at European member states, and they've generally found it to be a nice synthesis of some of the principles that then they can take back to their jurisdictions and apply. So I'll also share that in the chat when I'm finished now. And yeah, I'll pause there. Well, I'll just say one more thing, sorry, which is, I think the one thing we like to really work on challenges and barriers. We were talking about some of the barriers to building transmission. I think we also just have to always also take a step back and take a look at how to minimize some of the barriers and challenges. Melanie, you mentioned the Net Zero America study. One of kind of the interesting underlying suggestions of that study was also that, if you include more clean, firm development in some of your pathways, right, nuclear CCS, you can lower how much transmission you need. You can lower how much critical minerals and land you will use. And kind of having the ability to step back and also change strategies, not just kind of tackle barriers head on, I think would be quite worthwhile as well.
Casper's great points. I look forward to reading your report. One thing I would recommend right now, and Christine Scanlon, the CEO of Keystone, needed to leave to brief the Colorado Chamber of Commerce, but after this roundtable, I will call her and suggest that Keystone convene a kind of an emergency dialogue on regulatory reform, especially with reference to transmission lines being built. And I will recommend that she contact each of you to see whether your organizations could participate. Our think tank will help as well. But it's I don't see this problem being solved within the time frame that's needed. And despite some tremendous thinking on the subject, we don't have a simple package to present to Congress. And this is not necessarily the most collegial Congress to work something through, but there is some bipartisan support on these issues. It's growing. And so I will make that recommendation to Christine, and I hope that I can't imagine 4 people that would be more knowledgeable or more helpful in maybe serving as a steering committee for that dialogue. And we have about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to give my dear friend Sue Tierney a 3 or 4 minute soundbite on energy efficiency. And then I'm going to kind of move into a lightning round and ask each of you to just take a couple of sentences to very quickly convey to the audience the key theme you would like to end the day with. So Sue, you're up on energy efficiency.
Thank you so much. Everybody has talked about the build out challenges associated with this this transition that we're facing. And if the demand side issues are not addressed, then electrification is going to just really build things out on the electric system. And I think that there are really 3 things on the demand side of this story that really merit everybody's attention. And everybody on this panel knows this, so I apologize, but it's just a through line that's worth bringing up in the context of our conversation. These 3 elements associated with the demand side are not focused on electrification. That's a separate issue. And of course, we need to spend so much time on attention on that. One of them is energy efficiency measures. A second is pricing electricity. And a third one is just the array of distributed energy resources that are on either the customer side or the distribution side of the bulk power system. Let me just talk just a minute about energy efficiency, although the other things could merit tons of attention, and they are all part of the all of the above scenarios that Carl just mentioned. Energy efficiency, we know, spans efficiency of the power generation system, efficiency of transmitting power. It addresses energy efficiency of vehicle technologies, and all of those are really important to decarbonization. Of course, industrial sector. But if you think of buildings, which is what we often think about when we think about energy efficiency, it's a huge issue. A lot of people talk about how we need to upgrade building codes and a variety of other things associated with, requiring solar panels on every new building and so forth. That is the easy part. That is just the new stuff coming on the system. But 80% of the buildings that are going to be around, maybe decade, 2 decades from now, are already built. And these are just in terrible shape in a lot of circumstances. They often are landlord-tenant situations where the principal agent really isn't paying the energy bill and isn't going to be involved except by mandatory action associated with electrification issues. So there's a lot in the new federal legislation in the United States associated with creating carrots to get building energy efficiency done. Part of that is just straight energy efficiency grants, grants to localities and states for getting energy efficiency, weatherization programs. The EPA Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund provides 28 billion to help with things that could include energy efficiency. And all of these really need to come up in terms of addressing these barriers to getting much deeper energy efficiency done. It is low-hanging fruit, but access to capital, putting a through line between the incentive and the owner of buildings are really important to do. And there's huge, great work that's been done on this. Huge history of positive action led by states in many instances, but this is a critical success factor going forward. And I'll just stop at that, Clint.
That was just perfect. And the Alliance to Save Energy has done some really terrific work on energy efficiency. So we will cap this really rich conversation right there. There's so many things that I wanted to follow up on, but we'll just have to do that in another roundtable in the future. But let me invite each of you now to just make a closing comment, very short, just a couple of sentences, and we'll reverse order. And Kasparas, we will start with you.
Sure, yeah. As you mentioned, difficult to summarize this very rich discussion that's covered so many topics. I guess from my perspective, I'm happy to hear the panel talk about some of the challenges that need to be prioritized right now when it comes to pushing different types of technology optionality, and again, on the implementation side, right, and the planning side. Again, I think we need to be humble and take a step back that, despite all the progress that we've been making, our strategies are still not fit for purpose, right? That means we need to look for opportunities to increase the pace and scale at which we develop infrastructure. We need to prioritize energy dense solutions like nuclear and CCS, and we need to put a lot of effort at improving, our planning processes. You mentioned before that some of these issues are getting bipartisan support. And I think it's worth noting that underlying this is that if we are to improve how we go about this, it will not only have benefits for the climate, but will also have cost reductions for customers, right? Increases in reliability, alongside with helping to meet our climate goals. And I think that underlying benefit to society is worth it for both parties. So I hope that, you know, over the course of the next year, we get to work with a variety of stakeholders and educate them in terms of why this is important, not only for climate and make progress. So I'll end my remarks there. I don't know if that's what you were looking for.
Perfect. Yeah, very thoughtful. Thank you. Melanie, would you like to go next?
Sure. And I had my hand up when Sue was talking, and so I'm going to longer than 2 sentences. Okay. Sue will remember when the Department of Energy was founded, it wasn't efficiency, it was conservation.
Yes.
And we have forgotten about conservation. And I would just point out, and Clint has heard this before, I don't need a sensor to pull a paper towel out of the dispenser. Okay, how many things have we electrified that we could be doing mechanically? That's conservation, not efficiency. And I think we really need to do some analysis of that. But I would close, and I didn't get to say anything about this. And Carl said something about moving to electrifying everything. We cannot electrify key processes in the industrial sector. And you need a fuel. And right now that fuel is natural gas, by and large. In the world, it's coal. Okay, so another problem. But I will just give you an example. Glass, which we're all sitting here looking at glass screens. It's hugely important for modern technologies. 90% of the fuel we use in making glass is natural gas in the United States. And there are no technology options for the high quality process heat you need, 500 to 1,000 degrees centigrade. And I've looked at the value of the industrial sectors where it's about 40% of the heat you need is above what electricity can provide. And the value of those industries to the US in 1 year is over $1 trillion. So while we need to work on technologies to develop for high quality process heat, we have a need for fossil fuels, natural gas in the industrial sector. That's why I started with we need CCS for the industry at this point in time. Hugely important. And I'd say one other thing on that: there are processes that can be electrified in industry, probably 30 to 40% can be electrified with low quality process heat. But electricity versus gas prices, look at ACEEE, I'm on the board of that and the Alliance to Save Energy, did a study that said electricity costs are 3 to 4 times higher than gas for those processes. So you don't want to render your electricity or your industrial sector non-competitive either with high prices. And so it just underscores the need for CCS and where we need to be investing in technology development. So thank you all very much.
Great closeout, Melanie. And I agree with you 100% on the need to include conservation in the discussion of efficiency. Just look right now at what's going on in Europe in response to Putin's energy warfare. And there's some very, very effective conservation as well as efficiency, as well as speeding up projects that used to take 10 years. They're building a LNG facility or two in less than 2 years. We need to move really fast now. Carl, you're next, and then we'll let Sue have the last word. You need to just come off mute.
3 quick things. First, I completely agree with Melanie and what she just said about the limits of electrification. As I said, we think we can get to 60% or more direct use of electricity, but she nailed exactly the types of things that we are unlikely to be able to electrify, why we will need carbon capture on some industrial sources, why we will want to develop hydrogen as a high temperature fuel. Second, I also want to reemphasize what Melanie and I think Casper said a little bit on getting away from a US-centric view of what a decarb pathway looks like. We have incredible amounts of land in this country. We have incredible domestic resources of hydro and oil and gas and offshore wind and places to put solar. Not every country has that. Landlocked countries don't have offshore wind. Some don't have much of a hydro base. So just because we can follow a certain path that might minimize the use of some certain technology, that doesn't mean that other countries can follow that same path. Again, we need a rich portfolio, and some of the RD&D is going to have to come from the US and other advanced countries. Final thing, and I just posted something in the chat on this, on levelized cost of electricity. One of the biggest myths that we have to deal with in addressing the climate problem is the myth that solar and wind are now the cheapest source of electricity, full stop, end of competition, they're the cheapest. It's wonderful that that their costs has come down 2 cents, 3 cents, 4 cents per kilowatt hour, depending on location, et cetera, et cetera. But you can't build an entire grid out of low-cost solar and wind. Again, look at the IPCC report, the link that I put earlier. Look at the link I just posted on the misuse of LCOE in how we need to move forward and expand grids.
Here, 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 here. Doesn't include the cost of storage. Yeah.
Integration.
Clint, I
Great
have
job.
one thing to say as my final remark. My parents' generation were called the greatest generation. They saved us from a terrible, terrible outcome. We need to step up. I want to thank everybody who is on this panel and in the audience for everything they are doing to overcome the fact that we haven't been doing the same thing in terms of saving the world, and we need to save these the world for its people, not the planet. So thanks for everything you're doing, and Clint, back to you.
What a terrific panel. I had ridiculously high expectations for you all, and you really exceeded them. And Kaspers, I'm so honored to meet you and look forward to getting to know you better. Your comments today were just as rich as our wonderful veterans here. So I'm going to give you an ovation on behalf of our audience. And I just love this panel, and we will do this again. Okay. Have a great day, everyone.
Happy holidays. Thank you.
Bye-bye.